Now, I imagine that a few of you are probably thinking, what does a white guy living in England know about racism? And, what does this kind of pasty white nerd have to say about racism? That question is kind of exactly what started and sparked this conversation in a way. So the first thing to note here is that I have actually been the victim of quite a substantial amount of racism in my life, which isn't really what the prevailing wisdom would lead you to assume by looking at me. I grew up mostly in a town in northern England called Oldham. To those of you who aren't familiar with Oldham, it's important to note here that, like other places in the UK, like Bradford, Luton, towns around Birmingham, Oldham has a disproportionately high proportion of Muslims. And Oldham had been rather infamous in the days of my youth for racial tension between the Muslim community and the rest, and sometimes with actual open violence on the streets. And my own school days were marked by these kinds of outbreaks. We had on several occasions literal race riots break out in the playground and just beyond the fences. And police were regularly stationed outside to prevent quite large fights between Muslim and non-Muslim students. Now, I should probably say, you could probably tell by the glasses and the slightly goofy looks that I was a bit of a bully victim for all kids back in the day. But I can say that quite clearly that the abuse that I received as a kid was far more prevalent and far more violent from Muslim bullies than from non-Muslim. And that'll be things like unprovoked assault in and out of the school, property damage, group ambushes, and that sort of thing. Now, you might think that this sort of race-based targeting of individuals is a clear case of racism. But there is an idea nowadays, pushed obviously by social justice activists predominantly, that racism means something which it didn't used to. You might have heard the expression racism equals prejudice plus power, or some other formation to that effect. The idea is that racism is what they'd call a weapon of the hegemony. It's a tool by which the dominant power group in society, which is white men most prominently, allegedly, but whiteness as a general concept, consolidate their position against other groups in the kind of socio-economic hierarchy. I think that the underlying assumptions and ideology that fuels these sort of utterances are actually themselves deeply racist. We might kind of summarize it as the merging of the experiences and perspectives of different people within the same race, which is, I think, a regression to exactly the kind of skin-deep determinism which characterizes far-right racism and white supremacy, which these sorts of people claim to be fighting against. This whole kind of ideological package is not just hypocritical, it's also reductive, it's counterproductive, and I would also say that it makes its adherents profoundly stupid and ignorant. And I mean that in a very technical sense, as well as an insult. So this conception really does a couple of things which aren't very good if you claim to want to fight racism, which is firstly, it actually gives allegedly discriminated groups free license to manifest racism and other forms of irrational bigotry too, without criticism. And this is something that actually happens a lot as it happens. But it also assumes that everyone in the so-called dominant racial group is a recipient of the kind of spoils of the supposed racist power structure, and that makes them guilty by association. There really is nothing more racist than blaming someone for a crime based on the color of their skin. But the activists don't see it that way. What they see is what I guess would be an old Marxist dichotomy of kind of proletariat and bourgeoisie, tinkered by postmodernism, most especially into oppressor and oppressed, with all the good on one side and all the bad on the other. In this kind of formulation, my experience of racism is invalid because I'm not on the right side of that clear and immutable line because of my skin color. And I certainly think that because of that idea, we're moving away from an understanding that racism is actually an individual phenomenon. It's highly contextual, and we're moving towards more of a socialized and generalized way of thinking about race, which is not good. It's certainly the case that we do as a society tend towards that kind of one-dimensional collectivist thinking now. So we do tend to often leave quite overt and nasty examples of bigotry unchecked, and while being hypersensitive to other things which are probably less deserving of attention, like jokes, for example. And there are so many expressions of this kind of good, bad simplification that it's impossible to talk about them all and to give you all the examples that we could possibly think of. The examples of just outright and obvious hypocrisy and contradiction are so numerous that you just have to kind of shake your head and shrug your shoulders at them. I'm sure that everyone here can probably think about their own examples of this double standard. For example, you might think of why some things are considered expressions of supremacy, for example, while the exact same thing for another group is an expression of pride. And that certainly applies to more arbitrary categories than just race. But going back to that root, that postmodern formulation based on Marxism and the Marxist dichotomy, which leftists try to use to combat racism, is, I believe, an agent of its own destruction. It demonstrates that you can't actually fight collectivism with collectivism. As I said before, what they're doing is merging the experiences and perspectives of different people within the same race into a kind of homogenous blob. It's sort of an inverse of the racism that they're fighting. Instead of kind of assigning blame and ignoring virtue on the basis of race, they're just inventing virtue and excusing blame. It's just a double standard. You can't live by those because it just leads to contradictions and hypocrisy, as I said. So let's just consider for a moment the way that these people tend to talk about racial minorities. We've all heard the phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations. And it's no wonder that people who set these kind of lower standards of behavior and achievement on the basis of race find themselves stumbling over their own racist contradictions. It does constitute a kind of self-constructed implicit bias in many cases, which is another racist idea, incidentally. One of my favorite examples of this is when Joe Biden said poor kids are just as bright as white kids. And if you haven't seen this example, I urge you to go and watch it. Maybe not right now, but there's a radio interview between CNN's Areva Martin and Fox's David Webb, where she absolutely excoriates him for his white privilege, only for him to remind her that he's black. It's very funny if you haven't seen it. And it's such a great example of what I'm talking about. And now, I mentioned Ayn Rand before. I think she did a great job of identifying what the problem is here. Now, she wrote the following quote, which I'll read out. Racism, like every other form of collectivism, is a quest for the unearned. It's a quest for automatic knowledge, for an automatic evaluations of men's character that bypasses the responsibility of exercising rational or moral judgment. I think Jordan Peterson as well put it quite well in his GQ interview with Helen Lewis, when he said these collectivist ideologies that people use to analyze society, whether that's and social trends, whether that's race, gender, or whatever you might pick, they said he said they give their adherents a one-word answer for everything. And I think that's definitely the case here. You know, to think of some examples, why do women earn less than men on average? It's the patriarchy. Why did a police officer shoot a black person? It's racism. Why didn't someone think that trans people should compete in women's sports? Transphobia. You can go down the list where these obviously complicated problems are being trivialized by one-word answers. It's not helpful, it's not productive, but it does make you feel like you know something. So there's an obvious attraction there. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be some utility in looking at things with racial discrimination as a possible causal factor, but that's certainly possible. But to substitute your thinking in this manner, to shortcut rationalism and evidence for that one word answer is not a smart thing to do. And I did say before that it makes you stupid and ignorant. And I said that I mean that technically, and I do. If you are the sort of person who does have a one word answer for everything, whether that's racism or whatever else it might be, if it's a univariate explanation for the kind of intricate totality of human interactions, then you're not really thinking. And I think it's evident when you look at the sort of analyses that are produced by these ideologies, whether it's identifying a problem or diagnosing the cause of a problem. It's amazing how quickly they fall apart under the absolute least possible scrutiny. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. And I will say that these statistics are by no means conclusive or universal across countries. But the main point here is just to note the complete absence of critical analysis, the complete failure to even ask the basic questions of the statistics, which I am asking now. So the most obvious example is death at the hands of police in America. And it's just widely kind of accepted nowadays that Black people are disproportionately shot relative to their population. But if you actually look at the data, they're underrepresented if you adjust for just one factor, which is contact incidents. So how many times a cop deals with people of different races compared to the uses of lethal force. A more difficult one, for example, would be sentencing, where on average we're told Black people get higher sentences for crimes. Let's consider a couple of factors here. Let's say you use gender as a component. The trend is completely eradicated. So the whole narrative that race is the most important factor in sentencing evaporates if you just compare men and women. Or let's ask something a little bit more actualized, exclusive to men. What about the prior criminal history of the convicts? Just that one factor wipes out a substantial percentage of the disparity. Now, that doesn't exclude race as a factor, but it does tell us that there are other more substantial factors at play. And the typical shortcut thinking of these identity ideologies just never addresses them. And you need to address them if you want to actually solve them. Now, I'm not saying in any of this that the people who push these narratives necessarily either know what they're doing or have bad intentions. There are certainly people in that crowd who do, and I take a pretty cynical view, I'd say, on that front generally. There is a lot to gain from being a victim when victimhood can be monetized, and it certainly can be nowadays. It's always useful, I find, to ask yourself, what are these groups actually asking for exactly? And most of the time, it usually boils down to power and income. You don't see feminists complaining about the gender imbalance in bricklaying, or Black activists complaining about racial disparities in rural agricultural jobs. It's usually about political positions, corporate boards, visibility. But for those who have more honest intentions, you need a way to address racism that actually works. And I don't think that's to be found in adopting the exact kind of philosophical or epistemological principles your opponents use. Racism is rooted in collectivist thinking, and you don't and can't fight fire with fire. Now, obviously, coming from the position that I come from, I think the solution to the problem, wherever it appears, is instead to use individualism and freedom to fight the problem. In the very first place, I think bad ideas can't beat good ideas in a free marketplace of ideas. So free speech is crucial if we want a necessary process of creative destruction in the field of ideas. But I'm going to do a little thought experiment here, which should illustrate, I think, the integrity of individualism and by extension capitalism as the best way to deal with these issues. So I don't personally believe that there are any innate predetermined differences between the races in terms of their, let's say, their productive ability. And I don't think it matters really, even if there is. But let's now accept the premise of a racist for the moment. Let's just say that the white supremacist or the black supremacist is right about race. Let's imagine that either black people or white people are substantially inferior to the other. How does individualism and capitalism deal with this? How does it negate that racism, even if that racism is grounded in a factual assessment of innate differences? Well, individualism deals with men, as Martin Luther King wished, by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin exclusively. And a mind, a human mind, remains a human mind, even subject to any kind of innate deficiency. And a human mind is an individual entity. There's no such thing as a collective mind between inhabitants of a racial group, and no such thing as a collective achievement on the happenstance of being a racial member, or a racial member having achieved something. And even if it were proved, which it isn't, that the prevalence of, say, persons of superior intellect and moral character was greater for one race over another, it would still tell you nothing whatsoever about any given individual, and it would be ultimately irrelevant in any judgment or prejudgment that you made of them. The supremacists in this case are just posturing for, as I said before, the unearned, both in knowledge and also in self-esteem. And that could be the kind of arrogant white supremacist who claims credit for the products of white culture, shall we say, which the individual had no part in developing, or the deluded black supremacist who claims innate superiority because she has magic melanin in her skin, which is a genuine theory. The reality in either case is that a good, honest, intelligent person is good, honest, and intelligent regardless of how many savages happen to share their skin color. And a moron is a moron regardless of how many geniuses share his skin color. I also believe that capitalism offers a very practical way of, in a very real way, of bleeding out racists. There's a popular kind of slogan nowadays that reads, "You can't have capitalism without racism," but you can actually rebuke that with a purely rational argument. The economics of a free society offers its own intrinsic punishment for prejudice and racial prejudice. Let's assume again that the racial minority is actually inferior. And this was in some ways partially the case in early America, with a largely uneducated population of black people, freed slaves and direct descendants of that legacy, living in a condition of poverty. In a free economy, what you have there is a source of economical low-skilled labor. And what you have is a situation in which that supposedly inferior race have their own competitive advantage in the marketplace. And if you need proof of that, just look to the original introduction of the minimum wage in America, which was a policy designed overtly to price black labor out of the market for precisely the reason that I just described. In this case, all the racist does is deny himself access to a more cost-effective portion of the labor market for his needs. It makes him less efficient in business than those who aren't engaged in that kind of arbitrary discrimination, and it makes the businesses that he frequents more expensive than the rest as a result. Now, we should suppose, because it's largely true, there is no difference between the races. Even under capitalism, the racist has, in some senses, the opposite problem here. Anyone with a kind of cursory knowledge of economics should know that if you have a demand for labor and services, and the supply of that labor or those services is restricted in whatever way relative to the demand, the price goes up. This is basic. In a free society, the racist incurs the cost of his prejudice, just as any other fool incurs the cost of his own stupidity. If you choose irrationality over rational self-interest, it will play out exactly as one would expect, given that one is based in reality and the other not. Now, I'd just like to kind of finish here by expanding just on that philosophical point, which is that I think that there is a relationship between what is morally and intellectually proper for humans and the outcomes that we manifest as a result of that. If something is immoral, doing it, I believe, will be detrimental to the human condition and to the individual who practices it. And if something is moral, doing it will be a benefit to the human condition and to the individual who does it. Bad ideas in reality bleed their practitioners out in a very, very real way. And I think that individualism and capitalism empirically can be validated by an objective standard based on reality and outcomes in reality. They're good for humans because they're proper to humans as humans. And I think that applies to racism as much as it does to anything else. So that's really all I had to say on that. I'd like to obviously try and bring other people in if they've got questions or anything like that. If they'd like to throw them out, I suppose Kevin's the moderator, so you can take over from here, sir.
Okay. If you have got any questions, use the little hand up sign on the bottom menu if you can. And then remember to unmute yourself as well, because I think everybody may be muted at the moment. Hey, Peter's got one.
Hey everyone, how are you all? You all doing good?
Kind of.
No, I don't believe so.
Okay. Don't divide us. It's basically it's complete agreement with what you're saying.
That's
so
rare.
because of COVID last year, I've had to take part-time teaching work in a school to obviously pay the bills. An inner city London school. So I encounter, should I say, this kind of like low level ideological adherence to a particular school of thought, like amongst many of, for example, like the parents, even amongst some of the teaching staff. And it might be quite interesting actually, because the woman who runs the Electoral project is a girl called Anaya Falarin, British Nigerian, and she's a big proponent of classical liberalism. So she's a former conservative, now politically homeless. So she might be someone actually worth reaching out to from a political standpoint as well. But yeah, her project goes into schools and literally is the exact talk that you've just basically given. But also then focusing on how we need to view people as individuals, and there's a universality to humanity, and that is the way people need to be treated. And don't divide us, you might find interesting, and if anyone encounters this, I suppose in a professional capacity, don't divide us actually provide free templates and like letters that you can either give to the school or to your workplace, which allow you to frame the reference of your disagreement with this kind of school of thought. If, for example, you ever have to encounter diversity training, which I had to do an hour of, and the first thing I did was send a letter to the school saying like, no, this is why I disagree with it, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, I just thought I'd bring them up, and obviously thank you for the talk. I think it was very eloquent and very well put together.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's certainly the case that if there are projects, and I've not heard of those two in particular, but if there are projects out there that spread this message on a more individualist basis, then that's something that I think, especially with the deterioration of race relations, particularly since Obama took office, but it's been going on for a little bit longer than that. The deterioration of those relations as a direct consequence of the kind of collectivization of thinking on this issue. I think it's absolutely critical, if we don't want that to continue, to support projects like this. I do feel, on a more pessimistic note, that it is perhaps a little bit further down the road than we would perhaps like. Certainly this kind of thinking, and it's not just on race, it's on many different issues, is embedded quite substantially at all levels of schooling, right the way down to primary school. And I know some primary school teachers myself who are quite actively or at least aware politically, and who do, not to put them down, intimate to me sometimes that they spread that with their students, and that's perhaps they don't mean it in a bad way, but certainly that's the collective effect of it when you go up through all the different levels, and it's particularly pernicious in university as well.
Well, I think it's fear. I think that's what it simply boils down to. I think you have, for example, it was interesting watching the diversity training in the school that I'm a part of, run by a white woman, like trying to educate the black teachers on their own oppression, and that's obviously a quite like kind of like an ironic perspective to watch. But I think it's fair. I think kind of like a lot of people at the moment. Have you heard of Glenn McLowry? Or John? You might like two prominent black intellectuals from America. I think professor of linguistics and professor of economics at Columbia and Stanford, or one of the others, I can't remember. They do some quite good shows on it actually. And yeah, like he literally, his quote is that white people are sitting behind a desk pissing their pants at fear of being like called a racist. And actually, ironically, what we need to do is counter it with the rational argument of like, no, look, if race is a society, if race is a social construct, how is creating a society in which race is the central issue going to make it any better? And I think that's where, like, I think, that's a good argument to come from.
Yeah, I think the one thing to say about the diversity training is that there's, as far as I'm aware, no evidence that it works. And I've always resisted taking any of those kind of courses, and as yet have not been subjected to them. So that's one thing to say.
If you get the opportunity, I would recommend doing it, because I think there's no better way to take an argument apart than to fully understand it from the inside. So I think if you get the opportunity, they're hard to sit through. Luckily, they're only about an hour long. But I found after sitting through it, like it was the one and only time I've gone through it, I found that sitting through it reinforced all my arguments against it, which allowed me to then fully formulate that kind of like argument and a kind of genuine, look, I've sat through this and I disagree with it. So, but obviously, like, I think it's Harvard that came out and said the unconscious bias training, which was created by a Harvard professor, he has completely written off. He said, no, it doesn't do anything. And that's completely searchable. Like, it's a release paper that said this is useless. So
yeah, well, I did deliver a speech a few years back now, actually, maybe 4 or 5 years now, where I had a copy of one of these diversity training guides that my student union at university was subjected to. So I have read quite closely through those documents, and there were some absurdities in there, like there's an exercise to rank order the staff in the union according to their privilege score, which was very amusing to me. But these things, there's no evidence that they work. There's no evidence that the claims that they make about the prevalence of racism, and this is one thing to say, is that racism is actually not that prevalent. It's not as big a deal as is made out, even in with reference to, for example, America and police incidents. We're actually talking about very, very few incidents here. Less than 100 every year out of many thousands of police contacts. And I think there is a danger of overstating this issue, but as I said, it's been exacerbated by the types of thinking that we're using to combat it.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's, as you said, it's a political move. I mean, this is right out of the early 90s. This is right out of Peggy McIntosh, The Invisible Knapsack, I think, is the paper that started it all, where she listed 24 reasons why, as a white woman, she was privileged. And one of them was walking down the street and not having to see any black people. And it was like, well, maybe that's because you live in a white town. Which was like, it's absurd. But then obviously, I mean, it's rooted in postmodernism. which has its uses occasionally, but is mostly gibberish. So yeah, no, it's a political move. It's based on a power grab, and it is heavily rooted, actually, as you were right, in leftist ideology. I think in the 70s it was basically the left decided that the working class had rejected them, so they decided to go for every other identity group possible. And I think that's the correct argument to give towards it. But yeah, it was just a thank you. Really, really good, really interesting talk, and really, really well put together.
Well, thank you. I'm sure we'll move on to the next question now, but I don't know if anyone else picked it up, but someone saying that one of their privileges in life is not seeing black people is quite a racist thought. But does anyone else have any questions? Any more questions, I'd say?
Just feel free to chime in rather than put your hand up if you want.
Is anyone a racist here? I take that as a no. Yeah. I should have probably prepared some questions really to ask the crowd. Is there anything in particular from my talk or anything that I've said that anyone might have any disagreement with? I suspect we all come from the same kind of political perspective, but is there any kind of policy prescription that you would put forward that differs from my laissez-faire approach to this? Do you think that there is a need for the government to address this? Is there a society-led approach to this, or am I completely right and you can massage my ego?
Can I speak, Chris Farmer?
Go, Chris.
I think the best approach I've ever heard to this was spoken by Morgan Freeman, the actor, who was being interviewed, I think, on the event of something like, I think it was called Black History Week or something in America. And Morgan Freeman was being interviewed, and he said the best way to handle racism is to stop talking about it. And he said to the interviewer, look, I'll do you a deal. You stop talking to me as if I'm a black man, and I'll stop talking to you as if you're a white man. And let's just ignore the whole thing, because by the act of talking about it feeds the beast. And the best way to deal with the racism is to stop talking about it. And I thought that was correct. I thought that was the best way to do it. So I just thought I'd drop that to you and see what you could make of Morgan Freeman's comment.
Well, I agree with that, and I often got in trouble for saying in response to things when people celebrate the say election of minority groups or of women to positions of power or influence, that it's not actually a victory for women or a victory for black people or gay people or whatever else it might be. The simple fact here, I think, is if we're talking about equality and we're talking about true equality, and by that I mean equal access and outcomes which are not determined by sex or race, is as you say, that we don't need to talk about it. People saying that it was a step forward for America that Obama was black when he was elected, with the media placing so much emphasis on his characteristic, on that, as you say, that pointless and irrelevant characteristic, that when it came round to it, you had a president who was who many people believed was elected on his race and was certainly helped by that. It's the same 8 years later with Hillary and her attempt to do the same with her gender. I don't think that if you are in a position because you played up two irrelevant identity aspects that you can claim that as a victory for equality. you can't have it both ways. To say that my identity doesn't matter and shouldn't matter in the determination of outcomes in society and economy and politics, while at the same time using it as a means to give yourself an advantage. If you're there because of quota, because of affirmative action, because you got out a demographic group, you got out the black vote or the rural vote or the female vote or the gay vote or whatever else it might be, the LGBT vote, I don't think that is a victory for equality, personally. Others may disagree with me if they want to, but yeah, like I said, you can't have it both ways.
Anyone else?
Does anyone disagree with me?
Nope. Who dare disagree with you, Harley?
It's true. I am quite intimidating. Do we have any other thoughts from anyone?
I wouldn't mind a quick recap on the couple of minutes I missed, if people don't mind. Anybody remember what it was?
Actually, I was going to comment on how funny it is to see people of the supposed, privileged racial groups, or in other situations, gender or whatever, how quickly some of them leap not only to accept but vigorously defend the ideas of this whole critical race theory, and how hard they try to pin their identity to it, and relating back to the Marxist campaigns and such. I think there's multiple kinds of them, like the ones who genuinely believe in it for whatever reason, and ones who are cynically trying to use it to gain some kind of favor, or at the very least to gain the respect of people they want to impress for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, I think on the cynicism side first, and I've actually forgotten what the first bit was, but the cynicism side is something that I mentioned before. I think that's a large part of it. I've remembered it now. Is a large part of it. As I said before, you don't get many feminists complaining about the gender imbalance in bricklaying or plumbing. Or anything like that, and that's because there's no power there, there's no influence there, there's no money there predominantly. There's only work ethic, there's only your ability, and those things are not the goal of this. The goal of this is, as I said before, as Ayn Rand said, it's a quest for the unearned, for favors, for quotas, for affirmative action points and all that sort of stuff. It's for a seat at the table that hasn't been earned and isn't justified by the ability that you've demonstrated, content of your intellectual or moral character. I understand why people are inherently self-interested, and some people who perhaps don't have the right principles are going to try to manipulate systems for their own benefit. We have to try as much as we can to avoid that happening, but and to push the other narrative, and to try to get people to behave honestly, and to think honestly. But sometimes that's difficult, especially when we have a political system and an allegedly conservative party who believe this too. But there are, as you say, some people who are honest about this, who actually do believe in these things, who actually believe in critical race theory, who actually do believe that there is an oppressive superstructure, whether that's a patriarchal superstructure, whether it's a white supremacist superstructure, a cis heteronormative superculture, whatever you want to say. There are people who believe in it and see it. And my question really to those people is firstly, you're wrong that we don't live in those superstructures. We don't live in the hegemonies as you describe them. We don't live in a patriarchy by any comparable standard. We don't live under a white supremacist hegemony by any standard, or even a racial supremacy by any standard that you can compare to any society that exists now and any society that exists ever. And it cannot be determined empirically, if you properly analyze the data, that there are any substantive differences between the races, the genders, and the sexualities, economically or socially, which leads me to ask, why would you want to view the world in this way when it's not necessary, when the evidence itself disputes it? Why do you want to view the world that way? And I never quite understand why. I never quite understand why people choose to believe this when it isn't true. Perhaps I've been listening recently to the Jordan Peterson's debate with I think it was Slavoj Žižek about communism and how we are as a species having suffered and struggled for many millennia in absolute abject dirt scrabbling poverty, that we are built for struggle. And I tend now to be coming around to the idea that, well, perhaps it is an evolutionary reaction to the immense wealth and the immense prosperity and the immense comfort that we have, that these people have nothing better to do than to invent problems. And that could certainly be a symptom of it. But it is difficult to think, when it's not necessary to believe that this is true, that they actually still do. And I don't get that impulse. And I don't know why you would want to live in that world. I don't understand it.
Well, there's a lot not to understand about it. There's also probably just the ones who want to feel like a hero, like, again, completely failing to grasp the idea that the races are in fact equal and that skin color does not actually influence anything. There's the ones who just want to be, that one white person who thinks that all white people are racist. It's just odd. I can't think of another way to describe it. It's just really odd thinking. Some kind of weird hero complex, victim complex, both at the same time. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, everyone wants a challenge, but as I say, psychologically, I can't understand where these people are coming from. And it may be quite some time before I ever do, to be honest. And maybe this is just because I'm white, as they would say, but I don't feel the need personally to be a victim, and it would be very, very easy for anyone to pick out any kind of aspect of their identity or experience and use that as an excuse for why they've failed or why they can't succeed as much as they would like to. I don't get that impulse. I don't feel it myself. I don't feel it's necessary to provide excuses for yourself in that manner. And I certainly think that that's what people who believe they live under an oppressive system because of their immutable, irrelevant characteristics are doing. So, as I say, though, it's I don't understand the impulse. I don't have it myself, and I haven't had anyone explain to me why they want to live in that world.
Thank you very much, Harley. Thanks for the questions. Are there any more questions? Because if not, it'd be a good time to wrap it up because we'll be just on the hour.